Hi everyone, so today I'm with the first guest speaker on the channel. I'm in the Vault Performance gym with Dr. Brendan McLaughlin. A little background on Brendan. I've worked with him with players for about 7-8 years now. Brendan also works with a number of top players in the world, most notably I'd say being part of Team Justin Rose when Justin was #1 player in the world. And Brendan's going to give us a little bit of feedback today on what he looks for in hip hinge. So typically when we've all seen it many times when you look from the down the line angle and you'll see the coach draw the line kind of up the thigh into the torso of the body and look at the angle in which the hip has hinged in the address position. So there's just a lot of benefits to players being able to move well throughout the swing, setting up well in that area of the golf swing. So Brendan, first of all, what value is there to setting up well, hinging well at the hip?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think from a body perspective, I think how you set up predicates what you do for the rest of your swing. So the way I look at it and what I tell people is your setup is either going to allow the most movement options for you in your swing, or your setup is going to restrict some of your movement options. And obviously we want to do more of the former rather than the latter. So our setup really comes down to kind of our sort of makeup and our axial skeleton. So it's going to be different for different people depending on your height, depending on your shape, and depending on different things. But at the end of the day, we want to find the setup for you that allows you to get into your backswing with the most ease and access the most range of motion. And then what that's going to do is really going to help you in transition and through impact. So our setup is kind of the key starting point to what we do for the rest of the swing. So for me, again, it's sort of setting up in a position where I can access the most range of motion. So I'm just going to have Ian set up for me.
I'll go this way?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
So from a movement perspective and from a sort of therapist perspective, really what we're looking at is sort of the different curves in the spine, how we're using the pelvis, and importantly too, how we're using our feet. And so when we set up, we want to be able to get into position where we have sort of equal pressure in our foot. So the front of my foot, middle of my foot, and back of my foot. And what that's going to do is going to allow me to utilize my feet and utilize my lower body as I move through my backswing. And one of the big things too is, if Ian can stand up for me, a lot of times now, Ian and I sort of see the extreme where people think that they need to get this really rigid sort of what I call hinge position. And that effect on the spine and effect on the hip really starts to decrease range of motion that someone can normally easily access. So if you set up and you really kind of get into a deep hinge position, you can see how his spine starts to curve into extension. What he's doing through the pelvis and through the hip is he's actually decreasing the amount of range of motion he can access through the hip. So what I would tell people is when you set up, if you use a mirror to kind of look at your setup, is making sure I have a natural curve through here, but it doesn't start to get too much. And the other thing I want to consider too is a lot of times people, when they set up or they sort of look at videos or they're instructed a certain way, is they end up being already really, really into their heel at setup. So when they move into their backswing, they move more into their heel. And that's when we start to see interesting hand path issues and different things with the club. So we want to set up again in a position to allow the most range of motion. So for some people that might be more of a hinge, for some people that might be more of a knee bend and kind of a squattier pattern. But the setup is kind of really tailored to who you are as an individual. And again, what I would say is just whatever is comfortable and allows you to get in your backswing with the most ease.
It's seen there obviously just you put a lot of emphasis on lower back. Mm-hmm. So from working with players, 3D screens, maybe let's just really clearly show just the viewers, so when they are using a mirror, what to look for in the lower back. So when looking at getting a good hip hinge, prioritize the lower back just for health and movement overall, yeah? Yeah,
so if Ian sets up for me, I think one of the big things we see, obviously we want like a natural curve in through here, and what that is going to be dependent on who you are. as a player. But what I would say, I'm just going to take Ian's hips here. A lot of times what we see is we see this start to happen. So the whole pelvis starts to tip forward as we move back, and that's just compensation for different muscle and joint things going on. And what that's going to do is he's already set up in probably too much extension through here, and he's limiting his range of motion through the hip. So as he moves into his backswing, he's going to extend more through here, and he's going to have to create different compensatory patterns in transition. That's going to put a lot of stress through the back. So what I would say, just very generally, is as you set up, not having the curve increase, okay? And a lot of players, that's what happens. When they set up and they start to shift backwards and get the club down onto the ground, they start to increase this, and I don't want that to happen. And sometimes it'll happen at the level of the pelvis, we'll see it through here, but oftentimes it will also happen kind of where the rib cage meets the low back.
I love because so much of what we do and I speak about on the channel is going back to setup, back to the early phases of the swing, because so much later on is those, like you mentioned, compensations due to things that happen early in this week. So Brendan, thanks for that. Some really cool things for the guys to highlight. Couple little points for you just to recap. Start with, if you're looking at a good hip hinge, start with awareness of foot position, where the pressure is throughout the feet. And then second of all, get in the mirror and look at that lower back position. Let's make sure that we're not getting extended, not good for movement, not good for health. Thanks once again, Brendan.
Of course, man. Thank you.